Well, good afternoon, listeners. You're listening to Lament of Hope blog and podcast, and you're here today with your host, Danielle Richardson. I'm really excited today. I have a very unique guest, Mya-Rose Craig. She's located in the UK, and she actually just finished her bachelor's degree from Cambridge a couple days ago. She graduated, so it's awesome for her to be taking the time to be interviewed right now. But for those of you who don't know her, she's an environmentalist. She has a passion specifically for birds. And she's come out with a book called Bird Girl, and she's kind of known as the Bird Girl as well in the UK. And I wanted to invite her on to talk about her passion, which is very unique for a young person, as well as, what her hopes are for the future, what she wants to see different about the environment, how she thinks that impacts the youth specifically around the world. So, Maya, kind of to get started here, I mean, what gave you a passion for bird watching? Like, when did you did like were you a kid? When did you want to pursue that and actually
Yeah,
enjoy it?
yeah, I think that's always a good question because it was, especially when I was kind of a young teenager, it was quite a weird hobby, I suppose, or I didn't feel like I was part of the um common age group slash gender that was doing bird watching. But for me, I've been bird watching literally since I was a baby. I was 9 days old. The first time my parents took me bird watching. They're both very passionate about birds. So was my older sister. And so it probably wasn't until I started school, so when I was about 4, that I realized that not everyone likes birds, or not everyone's obsessed with birds, I suppose. And it was quite a weird realization. I didn't quite understand at first. Um, and so I had this just lovely childhood out in the countryside and out in nature. And I think that that is the reason that I became so passionate about biodiversity and climate change and environmental issues.
Now, what do you think it specifically about birds that you love? Is it the music they make, or what attracts you to birds?
Like so many things, it's sort of like I said, where it's almost not understanding why everyone doesn't love birds. I think that even the small brown ones, I think they're so beautiful when you look at them and their feathers and the way that they fly. Um, I find kind of the science between their lives, like their migration and kind of the rhythm of their lives. I find it really interesting. Um, uh, I think also actually one of my favorite things is just how they are everywhere. I think out of all the wildlife that we experience in our lives, maybe more so in the UK, it's a country that is one of the worst in the world in terms of biodiversity loss. They are literally everywhere, even in the most urban of centres. And I think it's just a lovely reminder that wildlife is everywhere.
Do you, can you give us, especially for those, I mean, even myself, I don't know a lot about birds. Um,
Mm.
are there any like facts you can share with us or share with the audience about birds that might be interesting?
Yeah. I love talking about ravens. They are scarily intelligent. I think a lot of the markers that we use to separate humans from animals are slowly dissolving. And I think ravens are a lovely example of that. They use tools, which was the thing that we defined ourselves with for years. They're great at using tools. They're amazing at problem solving. But also they experience such a range of emotions. They're notorious for remembering faces. So if you're nice to them, they remember. If you're nasty to them, they also remember. They have been seen doing things that the only explanation is that they're having fun, just kind of gliding around in hot air swells and things like that. And there is no scientific purpose. They're just enjoying each other's company and they also mourn. And there have been cases where people think they're having funerals. And I just think examples like that of birds and wildlife where they are just incredibly intelligent and clearly feel emotions and are experiencing very rich lives. I always find so interesting.
And why do you think it's important? Because I mean, this is your passion. This is what you're, you know, pursuing in your book writing as well as in interviews that you give. I mean, why do you think it's so important that humans be attuned to wildlife and specifically birds that you focus on? I mean, what do you think? Why
Mm.
is that important?
I think a few different reasons. I mean, firstly, I think the largest issues with we're dealing with today are due to a disconnect with nature and earth and wildlife and everything. In terms of, I think climate change is a result of disconnecting with nature in a way where the earth is only seen as a resource to extract from rather than something we coexist with, meaning that extraction of fossil fuels, deforestation, things like that are considered more important than wildlife. I think also people don't realize the kind of some of the knock-on impacts of issues like biodiversity loss in terms of food supply and agriculture and things like that. It's starting to create massive issues. But I also think in general the human kind of disconnect of which is it's very easy. I completely understand, but the human disconnect we have with nature is also just really bad for us. It's so important for our brains and for our mental health that we have a relationship with nature. It's about nearly 8 years ago now, the National Health Service in the UK started literally doing green prescribing, telling people to go outside and spend time in nature because it has such a positive impact, or perhaps a lack of it has such a negative impact on our mental health. And so I think that's kind of evidence of how important us having a relationship with it is. And like I said, in terms of birds in particular, obviously I'm very biased. I love birds. I think they're fantastic um, and incredibly interesting. But also, like I mentioned earlier, there's such an easily accessible form of nature that I think they play a really important role, and that I do a lot of work in terms of helping working class or minority ethnic like people of color engage with nature and the outdoors. And a lot of the issues are to do with not being able to afford to go out into the countryside and things like that. And so I think being able to see birds in your local parks and things like that is more important for our mental health than maybe we realize.
Have you seen, can you share any positive um, experiences you've had mental health wise from being out in nature?
Yes, absolutely. I think in general, as an adult, something I've learned from the hobby is just to kind of use it as a form of self-care, in that I think a lot of people find bird watching very boring because it's very slow. It's a very slow hobby. You're spending a lot of time in your own company, in your own head. And I think it's really good for you. And so quite often when I'm feeling very stressed or upset or overwhelmed or whatever, I will literally go on a walk and I'll go outside. And it's not always kind of a big hike into the unknown. Quite often, it's just going on a stroll somewhere where there are trees and I can tell that it helps. But I think also, my book Bird Girl that I published a couple of years ago, a lot of it I talk about struggles in terms of my mum has bipolar disorder, quite severe bipolar disorder. And one of the reasons my family spent so much time out in nature bird watching when I was quite young was as sort of a coping mechanism for that, for my dad and I, in terms of kind of, like I said, managing the kind of stresses that brought. But also in
Mm.
terms of my mum, actually, there were very tangible ways in which we could see that spending time outside, for prolonged periods over days, we could see the positive impact it was having. Even something as simple as kind of mitigating some symptoms of depression and things like that. And I think that's kind of where I originally learned that lesson of how nature really can benefit us.
Was it mitigating the depression for her, or you mean for you and your dad?
Both actually in different ways.
Hmm.
Um, I think for her, we did kind of learn to use it as a tool in that we never thought that it solved anything because obviously that's not the nature of mental health. But my parents, uh, it, well, I was very lucky because as a child, we very often went on bird watching holidays abroad. And we quite often planned those maybe 6 months in advance. And it was something that we would look forward to. And we would always come back very rejuvenated and kind of ready to face the challenges of life. So in terms of my dad and I, it was incredibly rejuvenating. But I also literally mean in terms of my mum, especially in terms of kind of the more depressive episodes, probably less so with the manic episodes, although still a bit. We could very literally see the ways in which it was helping her and benefiting her and healing her, which is why it was such an important tool for us.
It's interesting you mentioned that because mental health, anxiety, depression, um, emotional disorders of several different kinds. I mean, usually, the pull is always to be alone, right? To always
Mm,
isolate and to distract. Um, and when you were saying that, you go out in nature, you're looking at these birds, it's a very slow process. You actually have time to think. I think our culture, and, please feel free to elaborate on this, but it seems like our culture really does prize, though, a more fast moving, distracting environment. I don't
oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
I
that's
don't think people really want to think. And I think having that space to do so is scary for people. Um, so like for
absolutely.
you, mentioning that, was that something that you got used to, or since you were raised in it, it was never something where you were like, oh, going out in nature and experiencing silence and wildlife is not intimidating to me, because that's probably a rarity for a lot of people.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I'll say first, like I'm not different. I am completely addicted to my phone. I spend a ridiculous amount of time on it. I'm literally the kind of person that when I eat dinner, I need to like be watching something. Like it's not like I'm someone who's fantastic at sitting by myself and being alone with my thoughts. And I think you're right, increasingly so. Um, I think in terms of our phones and social media, but I think actually the nature of work and things like that as well. That there's very much an expectation of being very plugged in. And so I think, and that's one of the efforts I do make an effort to try and spend time outside in that I can see the ways in which I'm struggling, I suppose. There's a bit of like brain rot occurring. And and so I'm making an active effort because I know otherwise it will get worse and worse. And there's loads of times where I literally, I don't want to get up and go somewhere because I am like, stuck sat somewhere on my phone. But I think these days I often try and leave my phone at home when I am going on a walk, if it's the right space to do so.
Mm.
I do think, however, I am definitely better at it than a lot of people I know. In that, like you said, I grew up with it, and so, um, especially as a kid, I had to learn how to entertain myself when my parents were bird watching, which takes hours. You're quite often just sat or stood somewhere for hours, um, and so I think as I get older, I do think that was a very valuable life skill that I'm trying really hard to not lose. And I do think it's really difficult.
What kind of, thoughts when you do it do you find yourself open to when you're out in nature and you're not distracted by social media or the phone or people? What kind of thoughts kind of come your way as you're bird watching?
I think a lot of it, maybe not when you're watching the birds themselves, but obviously bird watching is a very slow hobby. You're spending a lot of time just kind of walking around. And To be honest, it's just the things that you think about when you are alone with your thoughts. I think you really have to synthesize things that are happening in your life rather than kind of skating along. And quite often, if I've been like struggling with things, especially if we're going on these holidays, these vacations where, we're quite often spending days bird watching straight. There's a lot of stuff I've like worked through. So in terms of that, it's fantastic. But I also think I think bird watching's great in that it's kind of a form of mindfulness or meditation. And so it's not necessarily that you're thinking, but rather sometimes I think the benefit is that you're not. And so especially when you're actually looking at birds, you're thinking about what you're looking at and you don't really have time to think about anything else. And I think that that is also really good for people.
Yeah.
And so I'm rubbish at like meditation and things like that. I find it really boring. And so I suppose even if I'm not recommending watching to people, I think that a hobby that takes that form that is slow and in real life and kind of stopping you from maybe pondering or spiraling, I think it's so important.
When you mentioned working through certain things, is there something you could share that you worked through while being out in nature and that was actually like positive for you?
Yeah, I think think of an example. I mean, I don't think it's always deep things in that way, in that, especially because, a lot of this was when I was a teenager. And so a lot of it was kind of thinking about maybe social things or things with my friends or like, stuff like that, where, um, I'm trying to think, like maybe coming to terms with things or maybe reflecting on my own behavior or figuring out what I want the future to look like. There was a lot of that. And I think it's kind of a more general kind of self-reflection on your life, at least for me. For some people, it's not like that at all. They're kind of chatting or they're just looking with no thinking, with just kind of the word bird, I suppose, in their head. But yeah, I think especially when I was a bit younger, I think it was really important in terms of working on, self-reflection, I suppose.
Hmm. Do because we've been talking about, all these positives, which definitely can be found and scientifically proven when you're outside, breathing in fresh air, just engaging with nature to some extent. Um, Now, I want to ask you, what would you say? Because there are, a lot of people who are concerned, obviously, about environmental issues to some extent, but they're really worried about going overboard, or that, even being labeled environmentalist for some people is like scary. People don't like that. That means that you're overboard with it. You want to. I think there's a fear around that label for a lot of people. Um, and for you, I mean, obviously this is what you have on your Instagram. This is something you're proud
Mm.
of. What, do you think that there's a difference between being negative with environmentalism, or do you find that it's completely a positive thing, or can it become a negative thing? Like, how have you, because, even like in the States, it's almost a political term, unfortunately. Um, so for
Yeah,
you,
that's mm.
how do you see positive and negative of even the term itself?
Yeah, that's really interesting in terms of that does to me feel like a bit of a cultural difference in that I don't think the concept of being an environmentalist is as political or maybe as partisan. Um,
Hmm.
in terms of it is often seen as kind of very uh I suppose maybe people who do go a bit overboard, or that's not quite the right word. But I think in general, there's much more of an attitude of um I suppose acknowledgement of environmental issues, and so it's more an idea that that person really cares about that stuff, and maybe people find that a bit obnoxious or a bit unnecessary, but it's not um but it's still kind of based on an understanding that it's people who care about an issue that's very real. Say in terms of environmental campaigning and the youth strikes and things like that, which I do think to an extent, obviously, that's maybe within my age group and things like that. But I think a really interesting difference is there's much less partisanship in terms of environmental issues in general, in that both our main left wing and right wing party acknowledge environmental issues and do to an extent have solutions to them in their manifestos, both in terms of biodiversity loss, agricultural issues, um, climate change, green energy, all of those things. And so um I guess that's where we're at. But I think also in general, I think, at least as far as I can tell, the younger generations are great or much more passionate, much more concerned about environmental issues. And so I suppose there's hope that, or I would hope that for you guys, there's kind of people embrace the term more and more as the group of people who care about these issues expands more and more. Because I do think even though a lot of people acknowledge that environmental issues are terrible, there's still sort of an unwillingness of a lifestyle change. And so I think that's why environmentalists or campaigners are seen as a bit obnoxious, because they're telling people they need to do things that they don't want to do. Um, yeah.
Well, do you think that there is any negative aspects that can be taken on? Like, are there, for you, like, do you find that there can be a negative aspect of being, so passionate about the environment? Do you think that people can go overboard? Or do you think there's a way to be like a balanced environmentalist, wanting to steward the earth, but at the same time, um, to do so in a way that humans can do, and then it's not a super burdensome um, expectation?
I think I don't personally think that there's a such thing as overboard in that way, in that I think partially because I take a very intersectional approach to how I conceive environmental problems and solutions. For me, people are dying, both in the global south and in the US and the UK. We had maybe 3 or 4 years ago the first person who died to do with respiratory issues in London, and who the cause of death was labeled as air pollution rather than say asthma. Um, and
Hmm.
so I think because people are dying, I don't think people can go overboard in that way. I do think there are often issues in terms of environmental communication. Like I think historically an issue with climate change communication has been that it's been very scientific, and that's actually meant very little to people in the scheme of things.
Hmm.
I do think maybe conversations are abrasive for some people, but I also think actually a lot of the responsibility for at least beginning to tackle environmental issues are governmental rather than individual. Um, in terms of uh, banning fossil fuel lobbying and engaging with green energy and a green transition, I think it is in the US, and protecting the environment, which I think a lot of those have been stripped back in the past few years, and all of that sort of thing. And so I think actually, um, I think that the big push that a lot of environmentalists are going for is for those very systemic large changes, which those are the ones that are the most impactful. Like at the moment, I think it's something crazy like 75% of, or is it 97? Anyway, it's a massive number of global emissions are from 100 companies. And so I think it's about regulation and and which is why I don't think at the moment at least I don't get the impression that people are going overboard too much because they're not, for the most part, as a movement at least, attacking people in that way, as a pattern at least. I think obviously you can't speak for individuals because there are people, it's a global existential issue, so there are people, every perspective, whether that's abrasive or not, is being embraced by someone.
Right.
But I think the more systemic stuff is the thing we need to keep in mind.
You were mentioning that environmentalists are often going to advocate for something that is difficult for people to do or not as convenient. Is there something you have found personally that you want to get better at doing, that you know you should do that would help the environment, but you find difficult just because it's not as convenient?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There's loads of stuff, and I'm never gonna claim that I live like this fantastic environmental life because I don't, and I think it's incredibly to do so, whether for economic or social or accessible issues. In terms of me, historically, I've traveled a lot, and obviously that's pretty bad in terms of climate change. I don't, I'm vegetarian, but I could be vegan, and that would be better for the environment. Um, I think, I don't know, I have a car, I have to drive where I live. There's loads of things like that, and the food I buy is from all over the world that has palm oil and things like that. Like I think, to be honest, being able to live a perfectly environmental lifestyle is literally impossible at the moment unless you like live in a organic commune somewhere.
Yeah.
Um, but I also think that there are a lot of impactful things that people can do that are greater than, say, like switching the lights off in their house, and that people aren't very aware of. Like the one I really advocate for is I'm looking at the company you're banking with, which is one people often don't think about, and looking at your retirement plans, in that a lot of banks, like I think Barclays exists in the UK as well, sorry, in the US as well, but it's like one of the largest funders of various things like arms and things like that, but also climate change and fossil fuels. And that's the people that bank with them, that's their money. And there are lots of things like that that are potentially a very in the scheme of things for people that are, very impactful. And so I think also, even if people are struggling with a lot of potential environmental change, there are easier things that they can do that don't cost them as much money or time when they can't afford it.
Yeah, what would be, because I know you mentioned the banking. What other things do you think that small changes people can make that would be helpful in better stewarding the environment?
Mm. I think if people have gardens, allowing nature to live there, lawns are horrendous for the environment. And participating in, there's something in the UK we do called No Mow May, where you allow your gardens to just go wild in the like during springtime when there's all the pollinators and the birds, putting out feeders and water, especially with the incoming heat waves and droughts and things. I think just allowing the area around you to become a bit more nature friendly, even if you live in the city, I think is something that's really beneficial. I think, I was gonna say cars, but the US is difficult in a lot of places if you don't have a car, isn't it? I think if you can afford it, thinking about a transition to green energy, which is far more affordable in the long term, as well as obviously much better for the environment. One thing I actually really advocate for is contacting your local politician, especially. one who's involved in um the highest level of government, not your local one, although any level is helpful, and writing them and basically indicating to them that their constituents care about these issues, potentially influencing their vote, and that it's something they need to think about. Because that is more than anything else what motivates politicians, wanting to get people's votes. And so I think basically showing the world that these are issues that we care about.
Do you, you were mentioning earlier, like, as you've been saying, heat waves and, all these aspects that people could do to change and make the environment better. Um, I mean, is it for you personally, do you ever feel overwhelmed by the responsibility? Because there are so many things that you personally, that humanity in general could do to steward the earth better that we're not doing,
Mm,
or um, just the fact that, there's also true that humans are fallible, right? We're not all powerful, and there's not always, we can't fix everything, even if we want to. Do you personally find that hard or discouraging at times that, because you have a really lofty goal and wanting to do something positive to impact people and the earth? Um, but do you ever feel like it's a huge responsibility, and does that weight ever discourage you at times?
it is a massive responsibility, and I think it's terrifying when you really think about what the future could potentially look like. And I do know a lot of people who, I mean, I'm 22. I started campaigning when I was 12. And I've seen so many people come and go because they've taken on the burden of saving the world, basically. They feel like they can't stop, have to do everything, can't take a break, and they've completely burnt themselves out. So I've seen a lot of that happen. And I think it's not helpful. It creates a massive amount of anxiety and stress. And so I think one of the biggest lessons I've had to learn is almost to stay in my corner to an extent, which isn't very nice because in terms of there are so many things I care about. I'm so worried about the state of the planet. But I think the way that I am most helpful is by having kind of my set of issues and reminding myself that this isn't a one woman show, I guess, and that there are loads of people who are engaging with environmental issues in so many different forms, and that it's as a group or a collective power that hopefully we're going to create the change or at least push the change we want to see. And I think that attitude's really important and kind of confronting these issues bit by bit. In that, even though I think the younger generation is seen as kind of the hope for the future by many people, but there was a survey in the UK a couple years ago now that showed that over half of people in my generation think that we're doomed and that there's no hope, which is crazy because
Hmm.
it's not true objectively, as
Doomed
a
in,
collective at least.
oh,
In
doomed in
the
what way? Like doomed
in t
environmentally or just doomed in
yeah,
general?
in terms of climate change, that we're
Mm.
doomed. And I think a lot of that is to do with facing the scale of the issue and going, oh my God, this is terrifying, which it is. Um, which is why I guess I think community is so important and collectivity. So I guess, sorry, to answer your question, I think I could very easily be overwhelmed and terrified and burn myself out. And I have gotten to the edge of doing that a lot of times. But I've kind of tried to make the effort to look after myself because I know that that's how I'm most helpful to the movement.
I wanted to ask you, because we've been talking about just the weight of it and the fact that, humans, there's a lot of responsibility on humans to do so many different things that they could do to help the environment. I've always wondered, Because I have yet to meet anyone like this, and maybe this is, just in the US. Again, you're coming from a different country, a different perspective, but for you, like, does religion play at all into the environmental issue? Like, is there any, because, um, there are several religious writings, particularly for Christianity, that talk about stewarding the earth and that that's something God wants people to do. Um, or for you, does environmentalism really have anything to do with God, or is it, just a completely different issue for you?
Um, I suppose for context, the UK is very Christian, or not very, but the schooling system and stuff is Christian, but so it's a combination of that and also I'm half Bangladeshi, so my mum's side of the family is from Bangladesh and I am Muslim. And I think it's kind of this weird combination where I'm not really motivated by religion in that way. It's more of just kind of a responsibility, a sense of responsibility and a concern for the future. But I do think that kind of sense of global community that I think is partially created due to religion. But that global sense of community is one of the motivating factors for me in terms of obviously environmental issues are impacting us in the West, but they're having a massive, terrible impact abroad in a lot of um kind of third world countries, developing countries, such as Bangladesh. And I think there's kind of this kind of sense of shared connection makes you really deeply feel the way, and partially for me, kind of heritage and roots, and kind of immigrant identity, makes you really feel the impact of those things. Such as Bangladesh is one of the worst impacted countries in the world. There are over 4 million. No, there were 4 million refugees in the capital in 2015. That was a long time ago now. Um, and and so yeah, I think for me a lot of it is motivated kind of a more scientific or environmental concern, but I do think religion always lends people kind of or in theory does kind of a sense of morality and purpose.
Has it been encouraging to you at all, especially with, what your family's gone through a lot, mentioning that your mom suffers with bipolar disorder, which is very hard on a family. Um, has your religion been a comfort to you at all through that, or have you found a lot of your comfort through being able to advocate for the environment, to be able to pour your heart into that and into advocating for, um, stewarding the earth? Has that been more of a comfort to you than your faith?
I do think in terms of family issues and some global issues, religion's definitely been there. I think actually in terms of the recent conflict in Gaza, maybe because of that kind of religious community, I definitely have connected more than I ever have historically in terms of praying and stuff. Um, but I think in general, my hope for the future, my faith in the future is rooted in, I suppose societal, economic, governmental, policy-based change,
Yeah.
um, and kind of I suppose in terms of these issues, I'm a very practical person in that I often have a focus on, or at least like kind of maybe not what I talk about, but personally have a focus on the kind of very practical, tangible change that need to be made in order to step forward. So a bit of both, I suppose.
I was just thinking, just when we were talking about birds earlier too, it came to mind. Is there a particular bird that you think your personality resonates with most?
Um, I don't know. I think it's so much harder to reflect on yourself. Like I've talked to my friends about this. We decided that my best friend is a hummingbird. kind of very cheerful and in a flurry. I think for myself, I genuinely don't know. I think also I'm very biased because some of my favorite types of birds are the kind of small brown ones you get in hedges, and things like that.
Are
But
they
I'm
your
genuinely
favorite
not
because they're
sure.
pretty or
A lot of them have big personalities. They're kind of garden birds that you see kind of at home a lot, and so I think they feel special. And I don't know. I think especially in the UK, a lot of people complain about how our wildlife's very dull compared to abroad, and people always go like bird watchers refer to LBJs, little brown jobs, which are kind of the small brown birds that no one really cares about. And
aren't
I
those
kind of
sparrows? Is that what you're talking
all
about?
sorts of things. Yeah,
Okay.
sparrows and wrens and kind of the things that people go like, oh damn, okay. Uh, and so I'm always trying to tell people in the UK that we have so many cool birds. But I genuinely don't know in terms of myself. I probably need to ponder on that a bit.
Well, I
I don't
wondered because
know.
your name is Bird Girl, but I was like, I wonder if she has a particular bird that she resonates with because you were talking about earlier about the raven and how they have such personalities. And so I wondered if there was any particular bird that you connected with more on that level.
Yeah, maybe like a crow or something actually. That would be cool. They're cool. Um,
But aren't
like one of my
crows omens of
yeah.
bad? In books and in classics, crows are always like death and sorrow and like Edgar Allan Poe, you know what I mean?
I guess, but like I don't know, people always like owls are seen as wise as well, and they're really stupid quite often. So I think like I don't know, I think they're pretty and I think they're smart. I'm not saying I am a crow, but I do think they're cool. I do like owls as well, actually. They're also very cool. Actually, I'm just gonna start listing birds and going, they're very cool because I think they're all very cool. But yeah, I'm not sure.
Maya, it's been such a gift to talk to you. Just like one last question.
Mhm.
What is what is something if you had an opportunity where you could get on a podium and you could speak to your entire generation, really our generation, people in their 20s and people who are just finishing college and are beginning their careers
Mm,
and beginning life. If you could have a podium and you could speak to all of them at one time, what do you think would be the most important life advice you could give to them, based on, obviously you're young, you're still growing yourself, but
mm.
what would you say?
I think like I mean, I think in terms of my campaigning, the biggest lesson I've learned is how to advocate for myself and the things I have to say, which I think is so difficult. It's such an underrated skill. Um, and so like I want people to be able to speak up for themselves and the things that they believe in. Because I do think that that is how change occurs when people are able to do that. And I think allowing yourself to be a bit abrasive and a bit annoying and to push on things, I think is incredibly important. And so I suppose I want I want everyone to have at least one thing that inspires them to the point of wanting to create change, and for those people and for everyone to figure out how to actually make that change happen, how to push
Hmm.
to make the world a bit of a better place. Yeah.
So you would say too, it's not good to lead a passive life where you're just not.
Yeah, I think it's less satisfying as well,
Hmm.
in the long term. I think, especially our age, like I think we rely a lot on young people to kind of push forward in terms of progress. And I think it's so important to be able to look back and go like, yeah, I did something. Um, and I think just caring about things is so important.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Well,
yeah.
well, Maya, thank you. I mean, again, you just graduated, you're super busy, so I'm grateful that you could take the time and to share with the audience, your heart for the environment, your heart for birds, um, and just getting to hear your perspective. It's been really unique for me. I've learned something. I'm just so grateful for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a really nice conversation.
You're
Uh,
so
you're
welcome.
making me think about things a lot, which is always great. No, thank you so much.